said you're from Ann Arbor?
Yes, yes, yep. Grew up in Ypsi, Ann Arbor. Started my education at Scarlett Middle, and then went to community high school for a year, and then Huron High School.
Good.
Yep, yep.
What year did you graduate?
92.
92.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I can hear you. Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, Ed's 92 and I was 91, class of 91.
Oh my gosh.
Good
I
old
still
days.
remember those days.
Those are great times.
Yeah, it was.
Ann Arbor. That's the thing. Like, we like to ask everyone that comes on, because back then there were so many countercultures and so many cool little scenes happening. Do you see that still happening in Ann Arbor now, or do you find it's kind of dissipated?
Well, I think we all kind of get settled in our own groups to an extent. And I think Ann Arbor still has a lot going on. My contact with the schools has to do with a program called the Historical Street Exhibit Program, where we educate students about the history of the town. And we do that in person up until COVID. We were doing that with Skyline and then with Community High, where we take students to the different exhibits that are installed around town that tell episodes or facts about Ann Arbor history. And all of us who are tour guides expound on that information.
Wow.
Areas around Community High. So I still have a certain amount of contact with Community High, and also I'm the head of a program called the Ray Detter Local History Award, and we give cash prizes to students who do projects where they explore something about Ann Arbor history. Now, we have not done that during COVID. So we hope that this fall we can get back to resuming the Ray Detter Local History Award Prize. And also in the spring, I hope we're able to do the historical street exhibit tours again. There are a lot of us involved in those tours. So that's my contact with the schools. And most of my friends are older people in Ann Arbor, but we still really treasure the uniqueness of the community and the creativity of the community. And I think there are people who do treasure that and try to keep nurturing it. But that's one thing that I do. Those are two things that I do.
That's great. You're exactly who we need to be talking to on this podcast, because we cherish Ann Arbor for a myriad of reasons. So we can greatly appreciate any stories that you're willing to share as well about the history of Ann Arbor. We love going back. We love it.
Well, my total teaching career, just to give a little background, my husband and I came to Ann Arbor in 1971 as graduate students.
Okay.
And Ann Arbor was the university. We agreed to come here. We considered a number of different universities, and I had always wanted to go to the University of Michigan, so we came here for grad school. And when I got my degree in library science, I worked for 2 years in Brighton, just to the north of Ann Arbor, and then because of my work in a school library association, I was asked to interview at Community High. Community High did not have a library when it opened in 1972. It went through a lot of changes the first 2 years, I understand. I was hired in 1974. And my entire teaching career was at Community High School. 34 years in the Ann Arbor Public Schools.
Wow, congratulations.
Wow. Yeah, congratulations.
Amazing.
So we saw lots of changes, but nothing ever stays the same. And the first few years of Community High when I was there, we were worried about whether we would even continue our existence because the school's enrollment went down a lot. And a number of us on the staff realized that we had to do something to tell the story of Community High and to promote it and try to attract students to Community High who would work out well in the school. We knew it wasn't for everybody, and we never made that kind of pitch. So as the school library media specialist, I put together a slide program that we took to the middle schools. And that was to talk about Community High and to promote what the program had at Community High. And I got a number of students to go with me. So we made visitations to all of the middle schools. And over time, that really helped. The message got out about Community High. And you have to remember that during that time, there was upheaval in all of the schools. People like to think Community High went through some kind of special process, but there was just, it was a revolutionary time, the early 70s. And it also was a time when the Ann Arbor public schools were overcrowded. The high schools especially were overcrowded. And so that facilitated the opening of Community High in the first place. People wanted change, which is why Bruce McPherson, who came from Pennsylvania and had experience with what was called the Parkway program, was hired because Ann Arbor was looking for a change agent. Now that's a whole history by itself.
Wow.
Bruce McPherson, his tenure as superintendent, but he was the one who brought the idea of Community High to Ann Arbor, and they had a vacant building, the Jones Elementary School, which had been closed for desegregation purposes. And the children who lived in the neighborhood, and by the way, I live in that neighborhood, were sent to elementary schools all over Ann Arbor, and they closed Jones Elementary School. For a while, it served as an administration building. And then when they decided to open Community High, to establish Community High, that was the building they chose.
Wow.
Right there in Carytown. And I think it's important to know that at that time, my neighborhood, you see, I live in a very old house here. I don't know if you can see the background, all the old woodwork. I live in the Community High neighborhood, and this was not considered a good part of town. We had heard from people, whatever you do when you move to Ann Arbor, don't move north of campus. Well, here we are living north of campus. We've lived in this house for 41 years. And so this was not considered the best part of town at all. And it had been, parts of this neighborhood had been slated for urban renewal. And it was a veto by Cecil Creel, who was the mayor at the time that passed, that kept the area, which ultimately became Carytown and the whole Community High area, from being demolished, because that's what they were doing back then. There were all sorts of cities that were under the wrecking ball because they picked African-American neighborhoods to be demolished and renewed, as they said. And they had a program called the Model Cities Program. And there are maps you can see. There's one that is on the website of the Ann Arbor District Library, which shows the blocks of houses in this area that they were going to just knock down. So if it hadn't been for Cecil Creel, who vetoed that, we wouldn't have Carytown, we probably wouldn't have Community High, and this neighborhood would not still be here today. It's the oldest residential neighborhood of Ann Arbor. It goes back to the very earliest days of the city when people started building permanent homes. And there's a whole variety of housing in this neighborhood, ranging from single family houses to apartment buildings to boarding houses and rooming houses. And it's that way because, of course, in the 19th century when the city was founded, and 2000, in 2 years, we're going to be celebrating the Bicentennial of Ann Arbor. 2024 is the Bicentennial of Ann Arbor. So the first neighborhoods were right here in the core of the city, just up from the Huron River, where they established the first village. And of course, people didn't have cars, they had horses, but they would live and work very close to one another. So that's why this particular neighborhood, where Community High is, has schools and churches and houses of all sorts of different varieties. And we have businesses. Carytown was planing mills. They were milling lumber, and that lumber was being used to build the city. And what was once Treasure Mart, that was another planing mill. And there was the Baumgartner Marble Works. That's where the Detroit Street Filling Station is now. You know, it's a very famous restaurant. So, and there was an agricultural implements store, and that's in the building where the White Swan Laundry was established. And then it's right there at the edge of the farmers market area. People lived where very close to where they worked. And of course, they were able then to walk to schools, walk to church, walk to businesses, walk for their groceries. And so that's why this neighborhood really tells a great story about the history of the community. And this was always where the immigrants came. When they first came to Ann Arbor, they came to this area around Community High. And it's always been a mixed area of ethnic groups. The Germans, the Irish, the Greeks, the Italians, African Americans. When they first got to Ann Arbor, this is the neighborhood they settled in. And then they eventually, over time, would move to other neighborhoods. And that's a wonderful part of the history of this part of town.
Wow. I just learned a lot right there.
But, you know, where Community High sits, there was another school on that site. The Fourth Ward School was on that site, and that was demolished. I think it was built in the 1870s. Wow. And it was demolished and Community High, or Jones Elementary School, was built in the 1920s. Wow. And so the Community High building itself is close to 100 years old. Wow. And it was a state-of-the-art building when it was put up. I think go ahead, Ian.
Well, since you're talking about that neighborhood and what's going on there, you make me think of things like Gabriel Richard and the Gandy Dancer train. Did the train station, was that like a part? I mean, I never did any research on this, but was that part of like the whole community? People would take trains there, get off at the Gandy Dancer and stuff like that?
Yeah. The trains were used for a lot of different purposes. They served as transportation. So people would come in from city. Students who were attending the University of Michigan before the age of cars, they would come to Ann Arbor by train. And there are, of course, lots of stories about how the circus came to town, and it came on the train down to the train station there, which is now the Gandy Dancer. And then they would have a circus parade up Main Street. Also, a lot of raw materials came in by train. Ann Arbor, of course, is surrounded by forest. Michigan was forested before, cities were established. And I told you there were several planing mills. The current Carytown shops, those were planing mills. And of course, if you look around Ann Arbor, you see lots of buildings made out of wood. Commercial buildings used to be made out of wood too. There's still one that's made out of wood that's still here, and that's where the Blank Slate Creamery is. That's the oldest commercial building, and that's made out of wood.
Wow.
But they had to take that raw lumber and plane it into a usable form. The boards that were used to build houses and to make furniture. There was an organ factory. In fact, the organ factory is still here in town. It's used for something else. But most economies were local economies. So everything was made locally, but you had to get the raw materials in. And Ann Arbor was no different than many other communities that were growing in the 19th century. We were different in that we had a university that was established here, and that brought even more people into town. So the students would travel by train.
Mm-hmm. I have another question, and I've wondered about this, and I've asked people, and I think I already know the answer. But University of Michigan being there, did that make schools, public schools, have to step their game up because there's such a Big Ten college campus going here? So we got to make sure these children that we have on our property are learning. Like, was it always about education in Ann Arbor?
Well, yes, there were schools almost from the beginning. There were schools established in Ann Arbor, elementary schools, and right on the northwest corner of Division and East Kingsley, just a block away from Community High, there was a girls' finishing school. The building is still there. In fact, girls used to come even from the East Coast to go to the Mrs. Clark School. There is another building that's on East Kingsley, just a few doors down from Zingerman's. That was the original St. Thomas School. I live on East Kingsley across from St. Thomas Church, but the St. Thomas Church is the new St. Thomas Church built in 1899. I share a driveway with a house next door, and that was the house next to me is the original convent of the St. Thomas Church, where the nuns lived, and they would have taught in the St. Thomas School. There were schools that were established here very early on. I'm sure that the university's presence here, in fact, I know it had lots of influence. For one thing, the University of Michigan has never had a really robust system of dormitories. So even now, most of the students who attend the University of Michigan live off campus. They live in houses and apartments. There are some dormitories. There are student apartments on North Campus, but most of the students are housed right in the town. That's always been the case. And many of the students who came early on lived in this neighborhood around Community High. We call this neighborhood now the Old Fourth Ward Historic District because in the 19th century, this was the Fourth Ward. Ann Arbor was politically divided up into 6 wards. This was number 4. It's no longer the Fourth Ward. We're actually politically part of the First Ward now. But the area where I live is called the Old Fourth Ward Historic District. And one of the things that this neighborhood served as was a place for students and professors to live. And there was a very symbiotic relationship between town and gown, the university and the neighborhoods. For instance, Arthur Miller, one of the most illustrious, one of the best known graduates of the University of Michigan, lived around the corner from where I live. He lived in a couple of places in Ann Arbor, but one of the places was just around the corner on North State Street. And many other people lived here because there are a number of large Victorian houses, and they served as rooming houses or they were owner-occupied rentals, but there were also boarding houses. But professors also lived in this neighborhood, as did business people. So this was always a very mixed neighborhood. There were workers, there were students, there were professors, there were teachers, there were professionals, there were blue-collar workers. And that's one of the things I love about this area, that it is so rich in that kind of history. And the diversity is unlike anything else. Anywhere else in the city. And it's because when you're just a small town starting out, people live together. There aren't, there's not the rich neighborhood and the poor neighborhood or any of that. People were just living in this neighborhood for a long time.
Very, very interesting. You know, Ed and I started this podcast, Ann Arbor Mentality, just because of the mentality Ann Arbor gave us as we went out throughout the earth after we left Ann Arbor. And it's something that we talk about a lot, the mentality that Ann Arbor taught us. And it's like, I think, I know I took a lot of stuff for granted after I left Ann Arbor, like me being raised as a child, literally on campus, because my mother came from Flint, and then she came to the University of Michigan and then ended up being a nurse there. Mm-hmm. But what happened was I grew up on campus, and just like Ed or anybody else, we were all big skateboarders, very young ages. So we're on our skateboards, mopeds, or bikes, normally going through the diag from, 80s, we were kids.
Yeah.
But we were so used to seeing a fluctuation of students coming and going. So African, a guy from Morocco, a guy from Nigeria, mm-hmm. a guy from India, a guy from Germany. And it was such a rotation of students coming and going. When I now realize it, when we left, it was just regular for us to see that. So mm-hmm. it was just regular. Oh, this is life. But then once we left and you start seeing these other places, like, well, this doesn't go on in these other places.
It really is a unique community in many ways. And I can tell you that in this particular area, because it was a place where people of very diverse backgrounds live together. I mean, there are very fancy houses in this neighborhood, but there are much more modest houses, and people just mixed in a different way. And I mentioned earlier, Community High is in the old Jones Elementary School building. Well, Elijah Jones was the first superintendent of the Ann Arbor Public Schools. That was back in the 19th century. So that's why they called it Jones Elementary. But he not only was the superintendent for the public schools, but he also taught Greek and Latin at the University of Michigan. Mm-hmm. So I think that the relationship between the university and the town was much more fluid in those days. Mm-hmm. And right. Of course, in the 19th century, the very definition of educated was to know Greek and Latin. Now, those things changed over time, but you weren't considered truly educated unless you knew Greek and Latin. So there it shows the value that a Greek and Latin teacher had for the community, that he was part of the public school system, but also part of the university system.
Yeah.
You make me raise another thought. I was talking to my mother the other day just about her stay in Ann Arbor, coming from Flint. And she mentioned in those days, which I don't know if it's the same as now, but everything was very shared between the residents, the faculty, and the students, meaning she would tell me she would go to certain libraries that were only for students or faculty, but she wasn't neither, but she would go in and use facilities like the bus, the library, certain things that weren't meant for the residents. But she said at those times, it was like pretty much shared in a certain sense.
Yeah. I can tell you, as the librarian at Community High, librarians like to help people, no matter where they are. If you have a question, if you need information, if you need to find a book or a newspaper article, they want to help you. And there were many times I would send Community High students over to the graduate library, and I said, that's a question that I can't answer, but I bet they can answer it at the graduate library. And knowing that the mentality of a librarian is, I want to help, I knew that a student from Community High could get help at the graduate library. And another thing that was really unique about the Community High program was the relationship that students established with professors at the university. There were quite a few students from the beginning of Community High who wanted to learn unusual things, subjects that were not offered in the public schools, just because you can't offer everything in a public school system. But we have on our doorstep this university that offers almost everything. And so students would go through the community resources program, and they would go talk to a professor personally and get permission to audit a class. And they would take that class for high school credit. And I don't think a student was ever turned down. A professor loves a person who wants to learn. And I can remember in the earliest days of community high, students studying ornithomusicology, which is the music of birds. I remember one student, I can't remember his name, but I remember, boy, talk about an esoteric interest. But he could pursue that over at U of M, and he could walk over there because of the community high proximity to the university. He could go over there and take a class or consult with a professor. I remember one girl taking Norwegian. There was a period of time where a bunch of students were interested in Italian. And they were all, I don't know, we must have had 6 to 8 community high students studying Italian over at the University of Michigan. Wow. And I mentioned Greek. I studied modern Greek over there, first as an auditor, and then I took the classes for credit, and then I turned around and I was teaching Greek to students on my lunch hour. And then I said, okay, now go over to U of M and take their modern Greek class over there. Now that's just not possible in most communities, but it's possible because of where Ann Arbor is. And it's also possible because professors love students who want to learn, no matter what their age, and librarians love to help people. So this isn't about official policy at all, because as far as I know, there was never an official policy about community high students taking CR classes, community resource classes at the University of Michigan. It was always an arrangement between a student and a professor, and the professors just didn't turn students away because they like to have people who learn, who want to learn. And community high students were very eager to learn. So we're really lucky. We're lucky because of our geography. We're lucky because of the community high flexibility. And we're lucky because there are teachers and librarians are generous people. That's their mentality. If you want to learn something, sure, I'll teach you. That doesn't happen everywhere.
No, it doesn't. And you make me think when I think back to growing up in Ann Arbor, early 80s, I'm in elementary school, but I can recall going over to people's houses, and the parents could be a steel worker, they could be this, they could be that, they might not be in the education field. But I always felt, now that I look around at my neighborhoods I'm in and this and that, it almost seemed like everybody had a certain level of education, no matter what, even if they didn't go to college. It just seemed like Ann Arbor had that vibe.
Yeah. I think people are generally connected to a far greater degree than they are in many other communities. And, when you look at what's available, you can, I've said to many people, there are more free events at the university in any given week than anybody could possibly attend. And I attend many free events, of course, not during COVID. That's really changed how we live in endless ways. But I still do Zoom classes or go to Zoom lectures, including those from the University of Michigan. I'm still very interested in modern Greek studies, and I just attended an interview with a Greek author that was done through the university. And it was a Zoom interview from Athens. And I thought, oh, this guy sounds really interesting. So I ordered one of his books, and I'm reading one of his books right now. It's a series of short stories. And that series of short stories is about everyday people in Greece during the time of austerity. And which is, in the earlier part of this century. There was just that opportunity, and as there are for many people here, and you can take advantage of opportunities like that, and look at music, look at the opportunities in music, the municipal choruses, the choral union, the festival chorus, the Ann Arbor Civic Chorus, and all the chances to attend recitals. Or last year, no, just before COVID, there were two African-American opera singers, and their names will come to me because they're both with the Met. And I'm sorry, I'm having a blank. And I said to my husband, I said, we're going to go over to Hill Auditorium and hear these guys. And we did. And it was one of the most wonderful evenings in our lives. And it was free. It was free at Hill Auditorium. So that just doesn't happen everywhere. Of course, there are lots of things you have to pay for too, but many things, the book talks at local bookstores are phenomenal. Borders started that, and even though Borders is closed, Literati is carrying on that tradition. It's a much smaller bookstore, but still has this rich tradition of local interest in learning and reading books and hearing interesting authors. So we just have a lot going on in Ann Arbor all the time. And the Ann Arbor Observer, which publishes a lot of the events, it tells you when the events take place, that's free to anyone who lives in Ann Arbor. So you can get this free publication, and it also has very interesting articles about the town, and you can see what's going on and plan to go to lots of different events. I hope we get back to that now after COVID, but that's what life has been like. I remember when I think it was Seamus Heaney, the great Irish poet, came to town, and he did a free presentation at Rackham, and of course you had to stand in line for a couple of hours, but it was free. And this happens a lot. Hillary Clinton came here, and it was free.
Wow.
So people are just interested. They enjoy knowing things and learning things, and I think we see that in all the Ann Arbor high schools, and we certainly saw it in community high.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I've read a book called In Defense of a Liberal Education, and it really opened up my eyes to a lot of part about education that I never really thought about. What are your thoughts on education right now? And after watching what we've been through from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I don't want to throw too much at you in this question. What do you think about education right now? And what defines a good school and a bad school? Because we have all these schools, some are considered good and some are considered bad. Is it what's inside of those bad schools to make it bad? And what do you see with education right now?
Well, first of all, about good schools and bad schools. When I was getting my undergrad degree, and I was a French major, by the way, so I was studying to teach French. I had to take a series of classes on foundations of education, philosophy of education. That was standard in preparation to become a teacher. And the teacher I had, I went to Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and my philosophy of education teacher, Sam Andrews, one of the most brilliant men I've ever known, he said, there's no such thing as a good school system. There's no such thing as a good school. There are only good teachers in good classrooms. And I think what you have to keep in mind, and that's something I think about even today. I think about it even though I'm retired from actually teaching in the schools actively. By the way, my son was named after Sam Andrews. That's how much of an impression. My son's name is Andy, so
wow.
Sam Andrews. And what's good for one student is not good for another necessarily. And I think what we have in Ann Arbor is a lot of choice, because somebody might want something really structured because that just makes them feel secure and comfortable. Another student might want a whole lot more freedom, and that works for that student. And so what's important in education is to have a variety of choices, and I think we do have that still in Ann Arbor from what I can tell. I think education has to be truthful, and there's a lot of discussion now about what is truthful. I think the whole critical race theory debate right now is really a debate about whether or not to tell history as history happened. And I've always been proud of Community High and how we've handled that. And I think it's true in the other Ann Arbor high schools too. But as I said, my whole career in Ann Arbor was at Community High. Just before I got on this Zoom link, I was watching MSNBC, and they were talking about the Native American boarding schools and how they're trying to rectify the mistakes made from generations of Native American kids being sent away to boarding schools to, deprogram them from their culture. Well, at Community High, we were teaching about that. While I was there, as a librarian, Cindy Haidu Banks, who herself is partially Native American, wanted to cover that topic in her U.S. history class. And so it was difficult, but I did succeed in finding books that had information about these Native American boarding schools. And yet that was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And now it's a topic throughout the nation. The critical race theory, well, we were talking about things like that, not in those words. Nobody was framing it like that. But I remember with Marian Evashevsky, who also taught U.S. history, she gave me the list of topics that she wanted her students to be able to cover, because each student would pick a topic to write a paper on. And they were pretty esoteric topics, like all sorts of different kinds of slavery, like Black people owning Native Americans owning Black people owning other Black people, and what we're most familiar with, white people owning Black people. But I came to realize from that slavery was a very complex topic in the 19th century. And she also, she taught about the Westward Movement and what happened during the Westward Movement. What did women do? What were the jobs of women? And what about the towns that were created with the Westward Movement? I remember having to get materials about things like mail order brides. And so that's not typical for any high school, and it wasn't always easy to find materials on those topics, but they were all part of the story of the Westward Movement. And I really enjoyed that. I so enjoyed being a librarian because I love those kinds of challenges. So those are just a few of the examples of the kinds of things that I had to do in response to what I felt was a very enlightened curriculum at Community High. And it wasn't the same every year. I mean, as our teachers found out more, they wanted to convey more to their students. And so I was always looking for very unusual things. Dion, you might remember in the library, I used to sell refreshments. I don't know if you remember that. Well, one of the reasons I did that is it gave me the ability, first of all, because our school was small, the budget was small. And but in selling the muffins and the hot chocolate and the coffee and tea and everything, I kind of had a petty cash fund, so I could go to Borders. I could order books at Borders. I could order books at Shaman Drum. I could see books at Treasure Mart that would fit our curriculum. And I did. I found a lot of great things at Treasure Mart, which now has closed, unfortunately. But I would find books when I'd go to the Salvation Army on some of these very esoteric topics. And the reason I was finding those books is because of the community we live in. We have people with so many different kinds of interests, but I could find a lot of stuff that we needed just by scrounging around in a lot of different places, in the bookstores, the used bookstores, the thrift shops and places like that. And I actually enjoy doing that sort of thing. So
wow.
the library at Community was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of fun because the teachers and the students were asking me to find very unusual things.
You know, when you're talking, you're bringing back memories of past guests. We've had guests on here from Community High School that have gone on to do just like incredible creative things, you know, and you find out 30 years later, like, wow, you know, this person's making movies. Like, that's cool. I remember when I was skateboarding with them on the front porch or whatever, or something like that.
Right.
But you make me think about, there's a couple of people we've had on here, maybe myself included, maybe even Ed, but there's certain teachers, there's the whole presence of the school. I think it was Aaron Almashi, or it might have been Cece Chen, that said, you know, and this is why it's hats off to you and the full faculty, and I know I just got to have a great feeling, but they felt Community, actually it might have been Greg Hunt said this, Community said, you can be you and we're going to back you. And another person said that school is what's helped them from just being a number and slipping through the cracks. It's like, it's really affected, as I'm sure probably you know, so many people, to where there could have been a possibility they could have been lost in the shuffle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and there were a few lost in the shuffle, or a few who had over the years, who had difficulty finding their own sense of direction. I mean, I can remember some students, we would just, you know, try everything. And there wasn't 100% success, but I think there was a lot of success, and there were a lot of kids who ultimately did very well, even if high school wasn't their greatest hour. Maybe we helped them with self-esteem and self-confidence so that they knew that they could become who they wanted to be.
Okay, now what you said right there, you hit a little flag in my head. Are high schools supposed to or known for doing that? What you said with the self-esteem and self-confidence, because when I think of a regular high school, I don't bring those words in there. I could do it maybe through sports, but what you just said right there, is that a normal high school thing?
Well, I hesitate to judge all high schools. That certainly wasn't my high school experience. But on the other hand, my husband, Jeff Crockett, I see his name is up here on the screen, but he went to Cass Tech in Detroit.
Okay.
And Community High is kind of like a little Cass Tech, drawing from the whole city, and a very broad and artistic curriculum. And he really derived tremendous self-confidence and self-esteem from his high school experience. I went to a little Catholic school in Farmington when Farmington was just a bunch of dirt roads, and high school was not that great. It was, you know, it was a bunch of rules, and you have to follow these rules, and if you don't, God will be angry with you. So it was highly religious in its overtones. So it was about the size of Community High, but the polar opposite in terms of point of view and philosophy. So there were lots, where I went to high school, it was just all about the rules all the time. And especially growing up in the 50s and 60s, women and the education of women was just really coming into its own. And so I think we're always at Community High, we were always striving to do better at things all the time. Reevaluating what we did and trying to do our best. And you know, it's interesting when I do the tour of the historical street exhibits, and I just do one area. I do the area around Community High, and I talk about Carytown and how Carytown came to be, and about the planing mills and the industry in town, because that was it was really what's called the supply side of town. It's where the materials came in the 19th and early 20th century to build the town, including the university. And I have on occasion gotten questions from students who are currently enrolled there about what Community was like in the earliest days. And they have heard rumors about how there were a bunch of burnouts and hippies. And I just say, listen, the 1970s, that was an era of upheaval for everybody, not just for Community High, but for Pioneer and Huron as well. So yeah, there were some burnouts, and there were some druggies, and there were some potheads, but it certainly wasn't everybody. But this was true of every school in Ann Arbor at that time, every secondary school. And so don't think that it was just something limited to Community High. I understand now, someone recently told me that Community High is the place for the real brainiacs. But it always was a place for the brainiacs, but the brainiacs were usually pretty down to earth. Didn't you think, Dion? I thought they were pretty down to earth.
Definitely, the real smart people, they're very down to earth, like, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think
there really wasn't a pretense there. People were just pretty down to earth.
Yeah.
Well, since you mentioned that, and you're talking about the school you went to, the Catholic school, I never got much information about it except for a couple friends we had. Was there ever any integration or walls put up between Gabriel Richard and community to be like, watch out for those kids? Or because I know we had that's where the rich kids are going, or what is or that? Like, what was the whole dynamic between those two schools being so close?
By the way, there were plenty of rich kids at Community High. You just didn't know who they were.
Right.
I'm serious. Every once in a while you'd hear, his dad is so-and-so or her dad is so-and-so. But again, that goes back to the lack of pretense that was pretty universal there. Yeah. I don't know what people said to Gabriel Richard students at Gabriel Richard. We had some Gabriel Richard students who came over for special ed services. And I helped them in the library a few times. They were always very nice, but I don't know what their teachers were saying to them. And I knew the assistant principal, still know him. I just saw him recently at Gabriel Richard. He's now retired. He's a great guy. He's very down to earth. So I can't imagine that he would be a person who would teach prejudice to somebody else. He's just not that way. But I know that the Gabriel Richard kids who came to community for special ed services were treated equally and were treated well. But I think that's what we did with everybody.
Because they've got a lot of history, obviously, there as far as dating back, right?
Yeah, well, St. Thomas Church, and it was St. Thomas High School.
Okay.
And actually, my first trip to Ann Arbor, when I was back in Catholic school in the 1960s, was to a basketball game at St. Thomas, Ann Arbor. That was my very first trip to Ann Arbor. And this Ann Arbor is known for its one-way streets and people getting lost because they can't figure out the streets. That happened. We were on a school bus, a group of students, and we were driving around what is my neighborhood now. And the bus driver wanted to know where to drop off the students to see the basketball game. It was at night, it was in the winter. And finally, he got directed around. I realized now he went down Elizabeth Street, which is just perpendicular to my house, and down High Street, and then pulled up on North State Street next to what was the gym there. And I remember getting off of the bus and thinking, wow, this hill is really steep. And, that's the area of North State where it starts to go downhill toward the river. So that's my first memory of Ann Arbor. Little did I ever realize that most of my life would be spent right here. But it's really interesting to think back when when you've had a very long life, and I've been very committed to education because education was everything to me. I came from a very large family, very poor family, but I always knew I wanted to go to college. So I got jobs, I saved money, and I worked my way through college, both undergrad and graduate school. And the one thing that was possible back then is that you could do that. I think it's really hard, given the high tuition now in universities, for students to work their way through school. I think it's much more of a challenge. But back then, I could pay for everything by working. I was a waitress, so I would really hustle for those tips and save everything. And then to end up in this kind of situation in a very educated community, it's a real gift, because all the people you rub shoulders with are interesting people with very learned points of view. They're people who read, who think, who study. And so this is like people say it's living in a bubble, but I think it's kind of like living in nirvana. It's really great. Mm-hmm. And even when people disagree, they're not just disagreeing because they hate somebody. I think in general, they disagree because they've really studied something from another point of view. And so it's a much more intellectual sort of thing. Okay. Doesn't mean it's all a bed of roses, but it's a different kind of atmosphere.
I agree. And that's a perfect place to end it there today. I'm sorry we have to. I could listen to you for hours. You are just a fountain of knowledge about this. I'd like to personally sign up my entire family for your tour.
Yes.
As soon as it opens back up, I'm ready to go.
Oh, I'd love to do it. To do it. Yeah. It's really interesting to learn about the people who came here and and created this town.
Christina, could you give us the name of that tour and a possible way us or our guests could check it out?
Yes, actually, you can see the historical street exhibits program. There is a special part of the website of the Ann Arbor District Library.
Okay.
And they have all the historical street exhibits right there at the AADL website.
Okay.
Something else that's a lot of fun to do if you have the time is to go through a section of the Ann Arbor District Library called Old News. And they have an ongoing program of digitizing old newspapers. In the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century of Ann Arbor, there were 11 newspapers in Ann Arbor.
Wow.
And so the district library is digitizing those, and you can actually read those newspapers online.
So cool.
So those two things, the street exhibits themselves are at the AADL website, and what we do as tour guides when we take students to the different exhibits is we talk more about what's in the exhibit, what happened at different times, people who might be pictured in the exhibit, what they did, what their role was in Ann Arbor. So we expound on it even more to give, kind of flesh them out. I just want to tell you something. The house I live in, this house belonged to John and Sarah Schumacher. And John Schumacher owned a hardware store on Main Street.
Wow.
And the building is still there.
Wow.
It's one of the most beautiful buildings on Main Street, but he started it, I believe, in the 1870s, and it stayed open until 1943. It was he died in 1890, but his son took it over and ran the hardware store until 1843.
Wow.
So I love the fact that I get to live right in Ann Arbor history every day.
That's amazing.
And that's true. Every building in this center part of town has a story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could recommend one book, they have it at the district library. Dion, if you're ever in Ann Arbor, or Ed, if you're ever in Ann Arbor, if you contact me, I will get you a copy of this book, okay?
Hey,
definitely.
Sounds good to me.
It's published by the Ann Arbor Historical Foundation. I'm the secretary of the foundation.
Nice.
And it's called Historic Ann Arbor, An Architectural Guide.
Oh, I love it.
So it takes all the old buildings in the central part of town and tells you the story about them.
Wonderful. Very cool.
Including the people who live there.
Great.
Well, like Britain vanishing Ann Arbor, do you ever think of possibly writing a book about all this stuff, you know?
Well, who knows? I wouldn't say never. In the Old Fourth Ward here where I live, I'm president of the neighborhood association, and we put out a newsletter twice a year. So I write for that.
Okay.
And the whole newsletter really is filled with bits about Ann Arbor history. We have another person who writes often about the churches in the downtown because they have very interesting histories, the people who went to the churches and when they were built and who designed them and things like that. And so in the last newsletter, I wrote an article about a community high connection, and that is John Whitney. I don't know if you knew John or Lyle Whitney.
Sounds familiar.
Well, their family has been in Ann Arbor for, oh my gosh, since the late 19th century. And the family still lives in Ann Arbor on one of the few farms, fully functioning farms, still in Washtenaw County. Wow. And John was in my forum at Community High in the 1970s. His daughter now runs the farm. They do regenerative agriculture, which is the kind of agriculture where you treat the land in such a way to enrich it. So it's not about exploiting it, it's about enriching it. And that requires that if you have herds of animals, and they do, they have cattle, they have sheep, they have pigs, they have chickens, you rotate them on the different fields that you have, because the excrement from the animals has a regenerative effect on the grasses. And so almost every Saturday morning we drive out to the Whitney farmstead, and that's where we buy a lot of our groceries. And it's run by John's daughter. So I see John out there with his wife, and he's looking after his grandkids. And this was a kid I had, he's 60 something now, but it's a very strong community high connection. We had a field trip out there in the 1970s because it was a dairy farm at that time. And he kept saying, I'd really like to have our forum out to the farm. And the kids weren't interested at first. And I've always loved farms. So I finally got them to agree to go out to the Whitney farm. And it was one of the most interesting field trips we ever had, because they saw how a dairy farm worked. And we went into the farmhouse, and 3 generations of the Whitney family still live in that farmhouse. So that's not very common either. But again, Ann Arbor. And both of his parents had college educations. John went to Michigan State, and so it's part of the richness of this community. And I just admire so much what young people are doing now and passing on this legacy of diversity in that way, because there's a lot of pressure to develop in Ann Arbor. So holding on to our farms, it's really important to have local agriculture.
I love it. I want to thank you so much. I know Ed and myself right now, our heads are rocking because we get so much information from guests like you. It's like we're in class. So I want to thank you so much for all your contributions you've done for education.
Happy to do it.
When we come back to Ann Arbor, you gonna let us take you out for a coffee?
Yeah, well, let me know. You've got my phone number, you've got my email, and I'll get you a copy of that. I have copies of the books.
Okay.
So right here at the house, and I think you'd really enjoy reading it.
Thank you so much. Okay. We'll send this out to our viewers, but we want teachers to see it. We want people in the education field to see it, who can just get a little more motivation, a little more energy, and really let the teachers know that we appreciate them. We appreciate you.
Yes.
Well, we appreciate both of you, Ed and Dion, And thank you for being such wonderful students, lifelong learners.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's our pleasure. Well, enjoy your Ann Arbor day up there. I hope it's beautiful. We're
it
prepared
is.
out here
It's
for the
beautiful
hurricane
today. It's gorgeous. So
thank you so much, Christina.
I hope you get back here soon.
Yes, we will.
We'll do.
Okay.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
your day.
Care. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Bye-bye.